The rain hammered against the asphalt when Jonathan saw something that made his blood run cold. The 8-year-old black boy who always begged for coins at the door of his office was running desperately down the street, carrying something wrapped in dirty rags. But it wasn't just one thing. It was two small forms moving weakly against his thin chest. Babies. Two newborns barely alive in the arms of a child who could hardly take care of himself. Jonathan slammed the brakes of his black Mercedes, his heart racing. For 3 years, that boy had appeared every morning at the same corner with the same wide, pleading eyes. 3 years of tossing a few coins out of the car window, imagining that was enough to soothe his millionaire's conscience. 3 years pretending not to see the growing hunger in that child's face. Now, watching the boy stumble in the torrential rain while shielding 2 babies with his own body, Jonathan felt something burn in his chest. A mixture of horror and shame he had never experienced in his 50 years of life. The boy disappeared into a dark alley between abandoned buildings. Jonathan hesitated for only a second before stepping out of the car, leaving it running in the rain. His designer clothes were instantly soaked, but he didn't care. He needed to know what was happening. He followed the muffled sounds of crying coming from the depths of the alley. The stench of sewage and mold invaded his nostrils as he walked through debris and piled up trash. His hands trembled, not only from the cold, but from the growing awareness that he was about to uncover something that would change everything. A faint light emanated from an opening in the wall of a condemned building. Jonathan approached slowly, his heart pounding in his chest. Through the jagged hole in the wall, he saw a scene that took his breath away. The boy had built a small shelter using cardboard boxes and plastic tarps. In the center of that tiny space, he was feeding the 2 babies with warm water from a punctured plastic bottle, moving carefully like someone who had done it hundreds of times. His own lips were cracked from dehydration, but he didn't drink a single drop. "Calm down, my angels," the boy whispered to the babies, his hoarse voice more mature than it should have been. "Daddy will get more food tomorrow." "You're going to be fine." "Daddy." That word cut through Jonathan like a blade. An 8-year-old calling himself the father of 2 newborns, taking on a responsibility that would destroy grown adults. And there he was, a man with more money than he could ever spend. Realizing that his daily charity of a few coins was a cruel joke in the face of such brutal reality, the babies cried weakly, their tiny voices echoing against the damp walls. The boy took off his own torn shirt and wrapped them in it, leaving his thin body exposed to the cold. Jonathan then saw something that stopped his breath entirely. A mark on the boy's left arm, a deep scar shaped like a T, clearly made by a hot iron. The same T engraved in the logo of his company, Thornfield Industries. The same symbol his partner Richard insisted on branding onto special properties during the darkest days of their business. Jonathan recoiled instinctively, his mind struggling to process the impossible connection. That mark couldn't be a coincidence. Someone had branded that child with his company symbol, turning him into property, into a thing. The boy seemed to sense his presence. He turned slowly, his eyes meeting Jonathan's through the hole in the wall. There was no surprise on his face, only an ancient, weary sadness that didn't belong to a child. "Did you come to take me back?" the boy asked calmly, instinctively protecting the babies against his chest. Jonathan couldn't respond. The question carried a weight he didn't understand, but that terrified him. Take him back. Why would a child ask such a thing to a stranger? The rain kept falling outside, but inside that dark hole, Jonathan faced the first real truth of his life. His wealth was built upon the suffering of innocence, and now, confronted with that brand burned into a child's skin, he knew there was no way to keep pretending ignorance. If you are enjoying this story that goes far beyond what we can imagine, don't forget to subscribe to the channel to uncover all the secrets still to come. "No," Jonathan finally managed to whisper, his voice breaking. I just wanted to help." The boy studied his face for long seconds, as if he could read his soul through his eyes. Then, surprisingly, he smiled. A sad smile far too wise for a child. "My name is Daniel," he said, adjusting the babies in his arms. "These are Hope and Grace. I found them in a dumpster 2 weeks ago." Jonathan felt the world spin. 2 weeks. For 2 weeks, those newborns have been surviving in the arms of a street child, and he had passed Daniel every single day, tossing a few coins as if that solved anything. "You need help?" Jonathan said, taking off his wet coat. Let me. Why now? Daniel interrupted, his voice carrying a pain that cut Jonathan in half. For 3 years you saw me begging for food. 3 years? What changed today? The question echoed in the damp silence of the improvised shelter. Jonathan had no answer. Or rather, he had one, but he didn't want to admit the brutal truth. He had only cared when he saw something shocking enough to shatter his bubble of indifference. Let's get out of here, Jonathan said, reaching out his hands. My house has space, food, warmth. Daniel hesitated, looking at the babies restlessly sleeping in his arms. Do you know a man named Richard? Richard Kane. The name hit Jonathan like a punch to the stomach. Richard Kane, his partner for 20 years. The man who had turned small, questionable deals into a multi-million-dollar fortune. The man whose methods Jonathan had always preferred to ignore. How do you know, Richard? Jonathan asked, though part of him already suspected the answer. He killed my mother, Daniel said with devastating simplicity. She worked at one of your factories. She found out some things she wasn't supposed to know. Jonathan's world collapsed. His company, his fortune, his entire life built upon a pile of bloody secrets, and Richard was at the center of it all. My mother's name was Ada, Daniel continued, his voice gaining strength. She was an accountant at Thornfield Industries. One day she came home crying, saying she had discovered money disappearing into strange places. Money that should have gone to wages, but was instead funneled into ghost accounts. Jonathan vaguely remembered Ada, a small, quiet woman who always worked late. She had disappeared 2 years ago, and Richard explained that she had found better opportunities in another state. Richard said she ran away, Jonathan murmured. Richard lied, Daniel replied, raising his marked arm. Before sending me to an orphanage, he did this. He said I belonged to Thornfield Industries now, and that one day he would come for me when I was useful. The T brand shone under the dim light, a scar that turned a child into a marked object. Jonathan felt bile rise in his throat. How many other children had Richard branded? How many other families had he destroyed? I escaped from the orphanage, Daniel continued, his voice firm despite the tears streaming down his cheeks. I've lived on the streets for 2 years, and when I found hope and grace thrown in the trash like animals, I knew I had to protect them because no one else would. Jonathan looked at the baby sleeping, so small and vulnerable in the arms of that brave child. Daniel had become a father at 8 years old, not by choice, but because he had understood something Jonathan had taken 50 years to realize. Ignoring suffering does not make it disappear. Is Richard still looking for you? Jonathan asked. Always, Daniel replied. He has men searching. He said one day he would finish what he started with me. At that moment, Jonathan made the decision that would change everything. Not just out of guilt or remorse, but because for the first time in his life, he was witnessing true courage. A child who had sacrificed everything to protect 2 abandoned babies deserved more than coins tossed from a car window. You and the babies are coming with me, Jonathan said, his voice heavy with determination. And Richard Kane will never lay a finger on you again. Daniel studied him for another moment. Then, slowly, he nodded. But as Jonathan helped Daniel gather the few belongings from the shelter, neither of them noticed the dark figure watching from across the street, speaking quietly into a phone. Boss, we found the boy, and he's not alone. The hunt had begun. In Jonathan's mansion, for the first time in years, there was life beyond luxurious emptiness. Daniel walked through the marble corridors carrying hope and grace, his bare feet softly echoing across the cold floors. The contrast was brutal. A street child in tattered clothes, surrounded by works of art worth more than most people earned in a lifetime. I've never seen so much empty space, Daniel remarked, observing the enormous, impeccably decorated rooms. The house I lived in with my mother would fit entirely in this room. Jonathan felt the weight of irony. He had built an empire to fill a void that only grew with each acquisition. Now, 3 abandoned children brought more purpose to these walls than decades of material accumulation. While Daniel fed the babies in the kitchen, Jonathan locked himself in the office. He needed to understand what Richard had done, how many crimes had been committed in the name of Thornfield Industries. He opened files he had avoided examining for years, accounts that Richard had always supervised for efficiency. What he found made him nauseous. $1 million transfers to offshore accounts, contracts with shell companies, payments for security services that were clearly bribes and extortion. Worse, a list of names under the header Special Human Resources. Ada, Daniel's mother, was marked as resolved permanently. There were other names on the list, entire families. And next to each name, a note about young elements transferred to special programs. Jonathan understood the full horror. Richard didn't just eliminate those who discovered his crimes. He kidnapped children, branded them as property, and used them in even more sinister schemes. Daniel had escaped, but how many others hadn't been so lucky? His fingers trembled as he found a folder titled Future Project. Inside, dozens of photos of children with a T mark, ages ranging from 5 to 15, all with empty eyes, all clearly under some form of chemical or psychological control. A noise in the garden made him freeze. Through the window, he saw figures moving among the trees. Richard had found the mansion faster than he expected. Jonathan locked the files in a secret drawer and ran to the kitchen, where Daniel was cradling Grace while Hope nursed peacefully. The domestic peace grotesquely contrasted with the approaching danger. "We have to leave now," Jonathan said, trying to keep his voice calm. Daniel lifted his eyes, already knowing he's here. It wasn't a question. The boy had developed survival instincts that adult men never had to cultivate. He could feel danger approaching like a wild animal. "I know a place," Jonathan said, grabbing an emergency suitcase he always kept ready. "A cabin in the mountains that Richard doesn't know about." "Richard knows everything about you," Daniel replied, adjusting the babies against his chest. "He has 20 years of information. Wherever you go, he knows." The truth of the words hit Jonathan like lightning. Richard wasn't just his partner. He was his controller-manipulator, the true owner of everything Jonathan thought he possessed. A crash at the front door echoed through the house. "Back exit," Jonathan whispered, guiding Daniel through the pantry to a hidden door leading to the backyard. But Richard had surrounded the property. Lanterns moved on all sides. Voices whispered commands in the darkness. Jonathan realized he was trapped in his own home, turning his refuge into a prison. Jonathan. Richard's voice echoed through the corridors. "I know you're there. Bring the boy and we can settle this civilly." Daniel grabbed Jonathan's arm, his eyes shining with fierce determination. "He doesn't want just me," he whispered. "He wants the babies, too, to replace the ones who've grown too old in the program." The final revelation hit Jonathan like an avalanche. Richard didn't just raise marked slave workers. He replaced them when they got too old, always keeping a stock of small children to mold according to his sick will. "There's one thing Richard doesn't know about me," Daniel said, his voice gaining a frightening strength for someone 8 years old. "Before I ran from the orphanage, I copied all his files, names, places, bank accounts, everything." Jonathan stared at him incredulously. "You have proof hidden in a place only I know. Richard wants me alive because he knows if anything happens to me, that information will get into the right hands." That was it. The trump card Daniel had kept secret. The reason he was still alive despite all the pursuit. An 8-year-old had outsmarted an experienced criminal through pure intelligence and planning. Footsteps echoed ever closer. Richard was losing patience. Jonathan looked at Daniel at the baby sleeping peacefully in his arms and made his second definitive decision of the night. They wouldn't run. It was time to confront Richard and end this once and for all. But first, he needed to hear exactly where Daniel had hidden that proof. "The evidence is in a digital safe," Daniel whispered quickly. "Programmed to send everything to journalists and the police if I don't enter a specific code every 72 hours. Jonathan was stunned. An 8-year-old child had created a security system that experienced criminals would take years to develop. "How did you learn that?" "My mother taught me programming before she died. She knew one day I would need to protect myself." Richard's footsteps echoed ever closer. Jonathan made a desperate decision. "Stay here with the babies," he said, handing his phone to Daniel. "If anything goes wrong, call this number. It's my private lawyer. He will protect you. Where are you going to end this?" Jonathan left the pantry and walked through the dark corridors of his own house. 20 years in partnership with Richard. 20 years pretending not to see the obvious signs. It was time to face the monster he had helped create. He found Richard in the main room examining the expensive paintings with his usual calm. 3 armed men accompanied him, but Richard dismissed them with a gesture. "Jonathan, my old friend," Richard smiled as if they were in a business meeting. "You seem troubled. Where are the children from the future project?" Richard's smile widened. So you finally discovered I thought you'd never have the courage to look at the files. Answer me. In safe places, being prepared to become useful citizens. You should be proud, Jonathan. Your money saved these children from the misery of the streets. Saved. Jonathan felt pure rage burning through his veins. You branded them like cattle. I organized them, Richard corrected, his voice gaining a dangerous coldness. I turned human waste into valuable resources. Each of those children now generates more value than they would have in 20 lives on the streets. Jonathan realized he was facing a complete psychopath. Richard truly believed that kidnapping and enslaving children was a service to society. The boy comes with me, Richard continued. And the babies, too. I have special buyers waiting for well-ard for newborns. Never. Jonathan, you don't understand. This is not your game. It never was. You were always just the pretty face of the operation, the respectable millionaire nobody would suspect. I built all of this. The final truth hit like a slap to the face. Jonathan had never owned anything. He was just a puppet, a marionette disguising Richard's criminal operations. The documents authorizing all the deals bear your signature. Richard smiled maliciously. Legally, you're responsible for everything. Every transfer, every offshore account, every permanent resolution. Jonathan realized the perfect trap. If Richard were exposed, he would take Jonathan down with him. They had built a partnership where both were condemned to eternal complicity. But I can be generous, Richard continued. Give me the boy and the babies, and we go on as always, rich, powerful, and free. And if I refuse, Richard drew a pistol from his coat. Then you have a domestic accident. Thieves break into your house, kill you, and kidnap the children. Perfect story. Jonathan looked at the gun, then at Richard's cold face. 20 years of partnership, and only now did he realize he had always been working for a demon. One last curiosity, Jonathan said, trying to buy time. Why mark the children? Why the Thornfield T? Because I am Thornfield, Richard laughed. I always was. You were just the pretty name on paper. Thornfield Industries is my creation, my legacy, and every marked child knows they belong to me. Then Jonathan heard a nearly imperceptible noise, an electronic click from the hallway. Daniel had turned on the phone and was recording the entire conversation. Richard heard it too. His eyes narrowed dangerously. Looks like your little protege is smarter than I imagined. He's smarter than both of us, Jonathan admitted, feeling a strange sense of peace. And you just confessed everything on a recording that's already being sent to my lawyer. Richard's face twisted into a mask of hatred. You have no idea what you just did. I did what I should have done 20 years ago. Richard raised the gun, but Jonathan didn't flinch. For the first time in his life, he was doing the right thing regardless of the consequences. Shoot, Jonathan said calmly. But know that Daniel has already sent all the evidence to the authorities. Your entire operation is going to collapse with or without me. The gun trembled in Richard's hand. He realized he had lost total control of the situation. Outside, police sirens began sounding in the distance. Daniel had won. 6 months later, Jonathan watched Daniel playing in the mansion's garden with Hope and Grace, now healthy, laughing babies crawling through the green grass. The sound of their laughter echoed through the morning air, replacing the dead silence that had dominated the place for decades. The transformation was complete. Where there had once been empty ostentation, there was now real life. The cold marble corridors were filled with scattered toys, children's drawings stuck to the fridge, and the loving chaos of a real family. Richard was in federal prison, sentenced to life after his criminal network was uncovered. Daniel's recordings and the digital files he had kept as a safeguard had completely dismantled the future project. 43 children were rescued from captivity in 7 different states, all marked with a T of torture, all slowly reclaiming their stolen childhoods. Jonathan had lost almost all of his fortune in the process. Federal investigations froze Thornfield Industries' accounts, and he voluntarily surrendered all assets acquired with dirty money. Only the mansion, some clean investments, and enough to ensure quality education for Daniel, Hope, and Grace remained. Ironically, he had never felt richer. "Daddy Jonathan!" Daniel shouted from the garden, using the name he had chosen for the man who saved him. "Hope is trying to eat grass again." Jonathan smiled and walked over, carrying Grace in his arms. Now 9 years old, Daniel had visibly grown over the past months. Good food, regular sleep, and the absence of constant fear had transformed the skeletal boy into a normal child. though his exceptional maturity never fully disappeared. "She'll learn," Jonathan said, gently removing leaves from Hope's mouth. "We all learn." Daniel looked at him with those deep eyes that had seen more than any child should ever see. "Do you regret it?" "Losing almost everything." It was a question Daniel asked periodically, as if testing whether Jonathan had truly changed or would one day regret his choices. "Never," Jonathan replied. And he truly meant it. "I spent 50 years accumulating things that meant nothing. You three taught me what really matters." The mark on Daniel's arm had been covered by an artistic tattoo he had chosen on his 9th birthday. A tree growing through an old scar symbolizing life sprouting from pain. The best plastic surgeon in the country had offered to remove the scar completely, but Daniel refused. "It's part of my story," he explained. "I don't want to forget where I came from." Jonathan admired that wisdom. Daniel had not only survived trauma, he had transformed it into strength, into compassion for others who suffered. He already talked about studying law when he grew up to help other children in similar situations. Hope began to cry, interrupting Jonathan's thoughts. Daniel immediately rushed over, caressing the baby's face with a natural tenderness that never failed to move Jonathan. "She's hungry," Daniel diagnosed. "I'll prepare the bottle." As Daniel ran inside, Jonathan sat on the grass with Grace and Hope. They had arrived almost lifeless in the arms of a desperate child, and now they were normal, healthy, loved babies. Daniel's love had saved them, and ultimately Daniel's love had saved Jonathan himself. His phone rang. It was Sarah, the social worker responsible for the case. In the first months, she visited weekly to ensure everything was going well. Now the visits were monthly, more out of friendship than obligation. "Jonathan, I have news." Her voice was excited. "The adoption of Daniel, Hope, and Grace has been officially approved. You are a legal family now." Jonathan felt tears burn his eyes. After 6 months of paperwork, investigations, and hearings, he was finally officially a father. It didn't matter that he had started as a millionaire at 50. His real life had begun at 51 on a rainy night when he decided to follow a brave boy. Daniel came running back with the bottles, his face radiating the pure joy only children can express. "Daddy, why are you crying?" "Because we're a real family now," Jonathan said, embracing all 3 children. Daniel smiled. That smile that had transformed a cold magnate into a loving father. "We always were, Daddy, from the very first night." As the sun set over the garden where 3 children played freely, Jonathan understood the most important lesson of his life. True wealth is not measured in bank accounts, but in the ability to love and be loved. An 8-year-old child had taught him that the greatest fortune in the world is having someone worth sacrificing everything for. If this story touched your heart as much as it touched mine, subscribe to the channel for more stories that show how love can transform even the hardest hearts. Millionaire follows the boy who always asked him for food, and what he saw changed his life forever.